The truth is, she decides your value before you even realize you're being evaluated. Not by your looks, not by your words, but by something far more invisible. The moment you enter her space, her mind starts running silent calculations, fast, automatic, and brutally honest. And here's what most men never understand. You are not talking your way into attraction. You are being decoded. Every second you hesitate, every move you make, every bit of energy you project is shaping a psychological story in her mind. And once that story is formed, it becomes incredibly difficult to change. The truth is, most people believe attraction begins when a conversation starts, but in reality, it begins long before a single word is spoken. The moment you enter a space, something silent and invisible begins to happen. You are no longer just a person walking in. You become a signal, a pattern, a presence that is instantly interpreted by the human mind. And this interpretation is not slow or logical. It is fast, automatic, and deeply rooted in subconscious psychology shaped by years of experience, emotion, and instinct. Before anything conscious is understood, the brain first tries to answer a simple question: what kind of energy is this? It scans for emotional stability, not perfection. It looks for signs of control, not dominance. Because at a subconscious level, the human mind is always searching for safety before connection. If your presence feels uncertain, rushed, or internally scattered, it is immediately registered, even if you say nothing wrong. And if your presence feels calm, grounded, and steady, it creates a subtle sense of trust that cannot be forced through words. What most people don't realize is that silence is never truly silent. When you say nothing, your body language speaks louder than anything else. Your posture, your eye movement, the way you hold your breath, the way you occupy space, all of it becomes information. In fact, the mind often trusts nonverbal signals more than verbal ones because they are harder to fake. This is why someone can speak confidently, but still feel uncertain to others, while another person may say very little yet command attention without effort. It is not about trying to impress, it is about what your presence communicates when you are not trying at all. And in those first moments, the brain also begins assigning what can only be described as a status interpretation. Not social status in the material sense, but perceived self-value. This is built from micro behaviors that happen so quickly, you may not even notice them yourself. A slight hesitation before speaking, a lack of eye contact stability, or overly eager movements can quietly reduce perceived confidence. On the other hand, calm pacing, natural eye contact, and unforced movements create the impression of internal certainty. The mind translates this as emotional strength, even without any achievements being mentioned. But attraction is not only about strength, it is also about tension. When everything is too predictable, too available, or too emotionally transparent too quickly, the psychological tension disappears. And without tension, curiosity fades. The human brain is wired to stay interested in what it cannot fully predict. This is why over-explaining yourself, trying too hard to be understood, or filling every silence can unintentionally reduce attraction. Not because honesty is wrong, but because too much clarity too soon removes the space where curiosity lives. At the same time, inconsistency in behavior creates internal conflict in the observer's mind. If your words say one thing but your energy says another, the brain notices. It doesn't always know how to explain it, but it feels it. And this feeling becomes a subtle form of distrust. Consistency, even in small actions, creates psychological comfort. The mind relaxes when patterns are stable. That relaxation is often mistaken for attraction, but it is actually the foundation that allows attraction to grow. Over time, the initial impression becomes a filter. It does not remain fixed forever, but it acts like a lens through which all future interactions are interpreted. If the first impression created calm interest, later behaviors are seen in a more positive light. If it created uncertainty or discomfort, even neutral actions may be interpreted negatively. This is why first moments carry so much psychological weight. They don't decide everything, but they shape the direction of everything that follows. And yet, the deepest shift is this: attraction is not something you chase. It is something that forms when your internal state is aligned. People are not only responding to what you do, they are responding to what you are projecting without words. The mind is always reading beneath the surface, always searching for signals that feel real, stable, and emotionally coherent. Once you understand this, you stop performing and start being present. And in that presence, everything begins to change. Because in the end, people don't remember your words, they remember how you made their mind feel. The next layer of understanding attraction goes even deeper when you realize that presence speaks before personality ever gets a chance. People often assume that conversation is where impression is formed, but psychology shows something very different. The mind has already started forming conclusions long before dialogue becomes meaningful. In those first moments, it is not your story that is being evaluated, it is your energy under uncertainty. Silence plays a far more powerful role than most people realize. It is never empty. It carries weight, interpretation, and meaning depending on how it is held. When someone is silent but internally unsettled, that silence feels different compared to someone who is silent yet fully grounded. The difference is not visible on the surface, but it is deeply felt by others at a subconscious level. The brain is constantly reading for signals of emotional control, and silence becomes the perfect canvas for that reading. If a person enters a room and immediately tries to fill every gap with words, it often comes from an internal discomfort with uncertainty. The mind wants to avoid awkwardness, wants to secure approval, wants to ensure there is no tension. But in doing so, something unintended happens. The space that could have created curiosity gets replaced with explanation. And the human brain, which is naturally wired to explore and interpret, loses the tension it needs to stay engaged. On the other hand, when silence is held with calmness, it creates a very different psychological effect. It suggests that the person is not threatened by the moment. They are not rushing to fix it. They are not dependent on immediate validation, and this creates a subtle shift in perception. The observer begins to wonder why there is no urgency. That curiosity itself becomes a form of attention. But here is where it becomes even more interesting. The brain does not just listen to silence, it studies how that silence is carried. Body language becomes the language of the unspoken mind. The way you sit, the way you breathe, the way you hold eye contact, even the slight pauses between movements, all become data points for interpretation. These signals are processed faster than conscious thought. They are not debated, they are felt. When someone is calm internally, their body naturally reflects it. Movements become smoother, gestures become less forced, and presence feels more stable. This stability is often interpreted as emotional control. And emotional control, in human perception, is closely linked to reliability. People are instinctively drawn to what feels predictable in behavior, but still mentally engaging in presence. However, silence combined with insecurity creates the opposite effect. Restless movements, avoiding eye contact, or overcompensating gestures introduce subtle noise into the interaction. The observer may not consciously identify what feels off, but the subconscious registers inconsistency, and inconsistency creates hesitation in emotional response. The attraction does not fully form because the brain cannot settle into a stable interpretation. What makes this even more powerful is that silence reveals authenticity. Words can be rehearsed, responses can be prepared, but silence exposes the real internal state. That is why people often feel more from what is not said than from what is spoken. The mind trusts patterns it can observe repeatedly, and silence becomes a mirror of those patterns. There is also a deeper psychological mechanism at play: anticipation. When silence is used naturally and comfortably, it creates space for expectation. The brain begins to predict what might come next. This prediction process releases attention, and attention is the foundation of attraction. Not because silence is doing something magical, but because it is allowing the mind to engage itself. Over time, those who understand this dynamic stop fearing silence. They stop rushing to fill it. Instead, they learn to exist within it. And when a person is fully comfortable in silence, it signals something powerful without a single word being spoken. It shows that they are not dependent on external reaction to feel internally stable. And in that space, perception begins to shift, not because something was said, but because something was felt. Because sometimes the strongest presence is the one that never tries to speak over silence. What most people never realize is that attraction is not built through effort. It is revealed through control. Not control over others, but control over yourself in moments where most people lose it. When a person enters a space, the mind of the observer is not looking for perfection. It is looking for emotional stability under pressure. Because pressure reveals truth faster than any conversation ever can. In those first seconds, dominance is not what you say, and it is not how loudly you speak. It is how calm you remain when nothing is guaranteed. The human brain is extremely sensitive to emotional chaos. When someone appears restless, reactive, or internally unsettled, it creates a subtle signal of unpredictability. And unpredictability at a subconscious level is often interpreted as emotional risk. But when a person carries themselves with calm control, even in uncertainty, something changes in perception. The mind begins to register that this individual is not easily shaken. They are not reacting to the environment. They are observing it. This creates a sense of psychological stability, and stability is one of the strongest anchors of attraction because it signals emotional safety without needing words. This is where a major misunderstanding happens. Many people confuse dominance with force, aggression, or trying to control the space. But real psychological dominance is almost invisible. It is the absence of panic. It is the ability to remain steady when attention is on you. It is the comfort of not needing to prove anything in the moment. The body always reveals this truth before speech does. Small unconscious signals like rushed movements, shifting posture too frequently, or inconsistent eye contact show internal tension. The observer may not consciously analyze these details, but the brain still registers them. And when tension is detected, perceived confidence drops instantly. On the other hand, when movements are slow, intentional, and unforced, they create a very different interpretation. The mind associates this with emotional regulation. It assumes that the person is not being controlled by the situation, but is instead grounded within themselves. And this creates an unconscious form of respect, even before attraction forms. But there is another layer here that most people miss completely. Calm control does not mean emotional emptiness. It means emotional regulation. The present still has energy, but it is directed rather than scattered. It is not about suppressing emotion. It is about not letting emotion control behavior in unstable moments. This is why some people can enter a room quietly and still shift the entire atmosphere. Not because they demanded attention, but because they didn't lose themselves in it. The human mind notices this difference immediately. It feels the contrast between someone who is seeking validation and someone who is simply existing without needing it. And here's the deeper psychological truth. People are always unconsciously evaluating who feels anchored and who feels reactive. Anchored energy feels safe. Reactive energy feels uncertain. Attraction grows where safety and intrigue exist together, not where chaos dominates. Even silence under pressure reveals dominance. When someone does not rush to fill awkward gaps, when they are comfortable being observed without overcompensating, it sends a powerful internal message. I am not controlled by discomfort. And this message is far more influential than any verbal statement. Over time, this kind of presence builds a psychological impression that is hard to ignore. Not because the person is trying to impress, but because they are not trying at all. And paradoxically, that lack of desperation is what creates perceived strength. Because in the end, dominance is not about being louder than the room, it is about never losing your center inside it. What truly shapes attraction in the modern mind is not what you say about yourself, but what your smallest actions quietly reveal before you even realize it. Human beings are constantly reading each other, not through logic, but through rapid subconscious evaluations that happen in the background of awareness. And within those evaluations, micro behaviors carry more weight than most people ever imagine. The mind does not wait for your achievements or your explanations. It builds a rapid impression based on patterns it detects within seconds. A slight hesitation before responding, a shift in eye contact, the speed of your movements, even how comfortably you occupy space. These details form an invisible language that speaks louder than words. This is where the concept of status perception begins to form, but not in the material sense people usually think of. It is not about money, clothing, or titles. It is about how internally settled a person appears when they are not performing. The brain is constantly asking, does this person feel grounded in themselves, or are they seeking validation from the environment? Micro behaviors are powerful because they are difficult to fake consistently. You can control a sentence, you can prepare a response, but you cannot fully hide hesitation in your timing or tension in your posture. And the subconscious mind is trained to detect these inconsistencies because, from an evolutionary perspective, they once signaled emotional instability or unpredictability. For example, when someone enters a space and immediately adjusts themselves repeatedly, fixing posture, overchecking surroundings, or rushing their gestures, the observer may not consciously analyze it, but the brain registers a lack of ease. This creates a subtle impression of uncertainty, not necessarily weakness, but instability and internal comfort. On the other hand, when a person moves without urgency, when their gestures are minimal and intentional, and when their eye contact is steady without being forced, the perception changes completely. The mind begins to associate this with internal control. And internal control is often interpreted as confidence, even if no words are spoken about it. What makes this even more powerful is timing. The speed at which you respond, the pauses you allow, and the natural rhythm of your behavior all contribute to how your presence is interpreted. People often underestimate pauses, but psychologically, a pause can signal either insecurity or confidence depending on how it is held. A rushed response can feel reactive, while a calm delay can feel composed. The brain also pays attention to congruence, whether your verbal expression matches your nonverbal expression. If your words say confidence but your body language shows hesitation, the subconscious trusts the body more than the words. This is because body language is harder to consciously manipulate for long periods, making it a more honest signal in social interpretation. This is why two people can say the same thing, yet create completely different impressions. One might leave an impression of strength, while the other may be forgotten quickly, even if both had equal knowledge or intention. The difference lies not in content, but in delivery at a micro level. Over time, these microsignals accumulate into a single perception. The mind does not remember isolated actions, it remembers patterns. And once a pattern of confidence or uncertainty is formed, it begins to filter future interactions through that lens. This is how initial impressions silently guide ongoing perception without any conscious decision. The most fascinating part is that most of these signals are happening automatically. People are not trying to reveal their internal state, but it is being revealed anyway through behavior that feels too small to matter. Yet in psychology, nothing about human expression is too small to be noticed by another human mind. And so, attraction or disinterest often begins not with big actions, but with the quiet language of micro behaviors that speak before thought ever gets a chance to intervene. Because sometimes the smallest movements decide the biggest perceptions. One of the most misunderstood truths about human attraction is that clarity, too, quickly can actually reduce interest, not increase it. The human mind is not designed to be fully satisfied in the beginning. It is designed to explore, to interpret, and to fill in gaps with curiosity. When everything becomes too clear, too predictable, or too emotionally available too soon, something important quietly disappears. Tension. Tension is not discomfort in the negative sense, it is the psychological space where interest lives. It is the feeling of not having everything figured out yet. And the brain is naturally drawn to that space because it activates attention. When there is nothing left to interpret, the mind relaxes. And when the mind relaxes too much, curiosity fades with it. This is why over-explaining yourself often works against attraction. When you try too hard to make yourself fully understood in the beginning, you remove the very uncertainty that keeps the other person mentally engaged. The brain no longer has to wonder, no longer has to interpret, no longer has to predict. And without prediction, engagement slowly declines. Human psychology is deeply connected to what is known as emotional tension cycles. These are the subtle rises and falls in curiosity that keep attention alive. When everything is stable without variation, the mind loses stimulation. But when there is a balanced mix of clarity and mystery, the brain stays active, trying to understand what is not immediately visible. This does not mean being fake or confusing on purpose. It means understanding that not everything needs to be revealed at once. The mind respects gradual discovery more than instant exposure. When someone unfolds naturally over time, each interaction becomes part of a developing psychological story, and stories hold attention far more effectively than complete information. Another important factor is emotional availability. When a person appears too emotionally accessible too quickly, the subconscious interpretation can shift from curiosity to certainty, and certainty removes the need to explore further. The brain is no longer engaged in figuring someone out because it feels like it already has the answer. But when emotional expression is balanced, not hidden, not overexposed, it creates a healthy level of unpredictability. This unpredictability is not chaos, it is depth. It signals that there is more beneath the surface, more layers to understand, more to discover over time. And the mind is naturally drawn to that sense of depth. Over-explaining also creates another psychological effect. It lowers perceived value of the interaction. Not because honesty is wrong, but because too much justification can unconsciously signal insecurity. When every action is explained, every intention clarified, every silence filled with reasoning, the interaction begins to feel overly managed. And when something feels overly managed, it loses its natural intrigue. On the other hand, when communication is calm, selective, and not overly forced, it allows space for interpretation. And interpretation is where emotional investment begins. The more the mind has to participate in understanding someone, the more it becomes involved in the process. That involvement slowly turns into interest. There is also a deeper layer of psychology at play, uncertainty with safety. The most powerful form of attraction often exists in this balance. Too much uncertainty creates discomfort, but too much certainty creates boredom. The ideal psychological space is where someone feels emotionally safe, yet still mentally curious. That combination keeps attention alive without forcing it. This is why people often remember those who did not reveal everything at once. Not because they were mysterious for the sake of it, but because their presence left space for thought. The mind continued processing even after the interaction ended, replaying details, trying to understand patterns, filling in gaps. And once the mind starts doing that, attraction is no longer something happening in the moment. It becomes something that continues in absence. Because in the end, what holds attention is not full understanding, but the desire to understand just a little more. The final layer of understanding attraction is the most important, yet the least obvious. People do not evaluate you as separate moments. They evaluate you as a continuous psychological pattern. Every interaction, every response, every silence is not stored individually in the mind. Instead, it is merged into a single evolving impression of who you are. This means your first impression is not the end of the story, but it becomes the reference point through which everything else is filtered. If the initial moment created calm interest, then future behavior is interpreted with more openness. If it created uncertainty or inconsistency, then even neutral behavior can be misread through that lens. The brain prefers stability in interpretation, so it tends to protect its first conclusions unless something strongly contradicts them. But what truly shapes long-term perception is consistency. Not perfection, not performance, but consistency in emotional energy, behavior, and presence. When someone behaves in a way that feels stable over time, the mind begins to relax around them. And when the mind relaxes, trust forms. This trust is not logical at first. It is emotional recognition built through repetition. However, consistency does not mean being predictable in a boring sense. It means being internally aligned. Your words match your tone, your actions match your energy, and your presence does not shift dramatically based on external validation. This alignment creates a sense of psychological reliability, which is one of the strongest foundations for attraction and respect. At the same time, inconsistency creates mental friction. When a person's behavior,